Bill LeVasseur is founder and curator of Another Face of Mexico, Folk Art Gallery and Mask Museum in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. Originally from Maine, Bill worked from 1968 to 1970 as a professional musician, singer, and recording artist with Decca Records. He then joined an advertising agency, launching a career that lasted 30 years. He was assigned to the international division of his company, and that took his family to Mexico City from 1974 to 1978, and then to Brussels from 1978 to 1983. He returned to Mexico City on assignment in 1994. In 1997, he retired from the advertising business and moved to San Miguel de Allende. Bill has been collecting Mexican ceremonial masks for as long as he has been in Mexico, and he still travels extensively to see and film dance ceremonies and acquire masks. His mask collecting hobby has now become an avocation to document and share the indigenous ceremonial customs with mask museum visitors, college audiences, and Mexican school children. The museum opened to the public in February of 2006. I am delighted to welcome Bill to share with us his knowledge about Mexico's ceremonial masking tradition. Bill, thank you so much for making the time to talk with me and share your expertise with listeners of Best Cultural Destinations podcast, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here and talk with you.
Well, your story is one that I identify with a great deal, as you discovered a passion and you have followed it with zeal, sharing your fascination with other people. So I'd like to start by asking you to give us an overview of your journey and how it led you to San Miguel and becoming an expert on Mexican ceremonial masks.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I know people in Mexico, anthropologists, ethnographers that have forgotten more than I will ever learn about this subject. So, uh, thank you for calling me an expert. I know a little bit about a very narrow subject, which I'll hopefully share with your podcast listeners. But it all started 25 years ago when my company in New York City sent me to Mexico City to do some work in Latin America. And my wife and I were invited to a cocktail party or a dinner party, and I met a Mexican gentleman who was an anthropologist by education and a mask collector, and he invited Heidi, my wife Heidi, and I over to his home on a Sunday afternoon for lunch, and that was my very first exposure to his mask collection, very first exposure to masks. And since he was an anthropologist, uh, uh, he was able to put everything in context for me. He would lift a mask off the wall and describe to me the indigenous group that performed it and the kind of ceremony was involved. And I just found it fascinating. I just got lucky very early on when we came to Mexico, to be exposed to this cultural behavior that I had no prior no prior exposure to. And every mask had a story. It had context, and I, of course, I was interested in the masks aesthetically, but I was really fascinated by the dances, the ceremonies, and so I started learning from him and started doing some academic research. I poured through the stacks in the archives at a few libraries, and eventually, when my Spanish improved or got to a point where I was comfortable going out into the countryside myself and visiting the villages, I started collecting masks locally, and uh, I've always been doing what I would call amateur ethnographic research. I interview people when I'm in the villages so I can understand the ceremonies, the dances themselves, and so I talk to the performers. I talk to mask makers in the local villages who are a very, very good source of information. Mask makers know all the characters in the ceremony since they're making them, they're carving them or creating them. And they also very often know about the pre-Columbian derivation of some of the ceremonies that are done today. And I also have conversations with the. I try to find the oldest people I can find in a village sometimes, because the elders very often know a lot more about the customs and traditions than do the younger folks who are performing. So I've been doing this for 25 odd years, and uh, developed a collection. The museum that I have has got about, I don't know, 600 masks in it that have all been performed, used in ceremony, and the museum is completely curated in both English and Spanish. So anyway, it's a hobby. My wife calls it a hobby on steroids, but it's something that I really enjoy doing, and I have museum visitors almost every day that I give a talk to, a 20 minute or so introduction to. So I really enjoy. It's uh it's uh, something that I got very lucky, when we came to Mexico, to have met this gentleman. I was introduced to him by the creative director. I worked for an advertising agency, and the creative director was a very good friend of mine. Introduced me to this family and this particular gentleman, and so I credit my friend Gino, and for the introduction, and of course to Haled Muyaz and his wife Stella, uh, Ogazon. Her name is Stella Ogazon. They both have passed on now. They're deceased, but their daughters continue with their collection. So I'm still an avid collector myself.
Well, Bill, I want to say I think you're quite humble, and I know myself. Um, Sometimes being self-taught, can carry with it a set of insecurities. But having visited the museum and heard you share some of your knowledge, I feel that you are an expert, at least certainly in my eyes. But to step back, the name of the museum is Another Face of
Yeah,
Mexico, and the masks that you've collected are made by Mexico's indigenous people, and it's they are part of the community life, the spiritual life, and Mexico has a very rich indigenous culture. And I'm wondering if you can share an overview of its diversity and, you know, tell us a little bit about, um, a couple of the communities
sure.
that you've developed relationships with.
Sure, sure. Well, first of all, just the statistics are pretty impressive. Most people who visit Mexico, particularly tourists who come to Mexico, um, don't really get exposed to the indigenous culture. These people tend to live in rural, isolated areas, particularly concentrated in central and southern Mexico. But if I can give you some statistics, it's pretty interesting. um, we're 497 years since the conquest, right? Since Mexico has been inhabited by Europeans, particularly Spaniards, and the arrival of the Catholic brotherhoods, the friars, the Dominicans and Franciscans and Augustinians. And for the last 500 years, Mexico is metamorphosized, or it's been trans uh, changed dramatically, uh, since the influence of Europe, and yet, still today, 497 years after the conquest, there's still a huge population of people in the country who self-identify in the census as being indigenous, and many of them are still speaking indigenous languages in their villages. Here are the statistics. According to the last census, which is 2010, uh, a question is asked in the census: what is your nationality? ¿Cuál es su nacionalidad? That's the question they ask in the census. And 89% of respondents in the census, this is household data, by the way, 89% of households responded by saying, we're Mexican. What is your nationality? Answer: Mexican, right? But 11% of the population of Mexico, when asked the question, what is your nationality, answered by saying, somos nahuas, yo soy yaqui, nosotros somos huichol, yo soy zapotec, nosotros somos totonacos, etc., etc., etc. They hear in the question, "What is your nationality?" I guess what they're hearing is, "What is your indigenous cultural lineage?" Perhaps, and they're responding by quickly identifying with their cultural ancestry, and it's really interesting. I think they're answering the question, "What is your nationality?" based on how they live, not where they live. And it's the how they live that I find fascinating when I'm visiting these villages because very often in these villages, in small communities, uh, they're speaking a native language. They dress in traditional ancestral dress. They celebrate Catholicism in a way that's quite syncretic or conflated or mixed in with pre-Columbian belief. It's quite common how they celebrate certain life passages, particularly the transition from adolescence to adulthood is quite interesting. Uh, and so these people are living uh, kind of in the past. There's kind of two Mexicos. There's the one you'd see if you came to San Miguel de Allende or a larger city or the beach resorts, and then there's this indigenous Mexico that um, uh, where over 1 out of 10 people or households in the last census identify quickly in answering the question, "What is your nationality?" They immediately identify with a subculture or an indigenous group. Incidentally, there are 62 today. There are
Mm,
62 different indigenous languages spoken in Mexico. Um, and they're all those languages incidentally are languages. They're not dialect one of another. They Somebody who speaks Otomi wouldn't understand somebody who speaks Setzil. Somebody who speaks Setzil wouldn't understand somebody who speaks Huasteco. These are separate languages. All those languages derive from three linguistic families, which I won't bore your listeners with, but it's really fascinating to see to travel to these areas that I go to see the ceremonies during the fiestas to see if I can acquire masks and do research because it's a very still a very indigenous country. According to the CDI, the Centro de Desarrollo Indígena, which is a government agency, in 2015, 25.6 million people in Mexico self-identify as being indigenous, which is 21% of the population. But the point is, I guess, there's still this huge population in Mexico
right,
that still, when asked the question, "What is your nationality?" they don't say Mexican.
right.
It's quite interesting.
Mm. Well,
Uh, they're yeah.
I think the diversity, in my own experience, having traveled a little bit in Mexico, I've definitely seen, that diversity. Now, I want to step back and frame the discussion of masking by looking at it more broadly. And masking is a cultural phenomenon that occurs in many different societies. And
Right.
before we get into some of the specific traditions in Mexico, I'd love to hear a little bit about, why do people do this? What does the practice mean?
hmm
And when did it begin? So if you could kind of share just the big picture for people, that would be great.
One, yeah. One of the things I see when I'm in these villages is a very strong sense of the community celebrating their sense of cultural identity or cultural cohesion. They're very proud to be Otomi, or they're very proud to be Nawa, or they're very proud to be they that expression manifests itself on steroids during fiestas. This is when a community or a village of indigenous people, many of whom are perfectly bilingual. They speak Spanish to me, that, but they're speaking a native language in their village. Um, they're expressing a very strong sense of cultural pride, and I think, and again, I'm not a social scientist, uh, but I think what that is a consequence of these people being marginalized and subjugated in some cases during the Porfirio Diaz regime, particularly 100 years ago. But it looks to me like what they're doing is reacting to the subjugation or the pressure from the outside. And that happened early on in the colonial period, where people were, people who weren't needed as slaves on encomiendas or haciendas, which are, land grants from the King of Spain given to Spaniards here in this part of the world. The natives on who weren't needed for that were told to live somewhere else, and often they didn't set up federal reservations like we did in the United States, but the consequence was the same. These people were told to live on land that often was that they were allowed to live on land that was often more vertical than horizontal, not near water. So from the very beginning, 500 years ago, or roughly 500 years ago, they've been marginalized geographically. And in the last 500 years, because of what I consider to be pernicious racism in Mexico, which we could talk about later if you'd like, these people have been marginalized socially and culturally and educationally and economically. And as a consequence of that marginalization, they've as a defense mechanism, as a group defense mechanism, they've developed this very strong sense of who they are as a subculture. I think that's the reason. I think that's the main reason why we still have this very rich indigenous culture, because they're hanging on to their traditions, hanging on for dear life, because they've been surrounded by people who are exploiting them, or taking advantage of them,
Right.
or uh, uh, marginalizing these people. So
Right. And before we go further into the traditions that relate to the mass that you collect, can you talk a little bit about the universality of masking and why
sure.
it's been done by people going back to whenever the tradition may have begun, just by people around the globe?
Masking started uh, in, in all inhabited continents. I'm eliminating the North Pole and the South Pole, um, Antarctica. The in hunter-gatherer societies, as humans went through uh, the the cranial development, roughly 30,000 years ago. As humans became more intelligent, I guess it occurred to hunters and hunter-gatherer societies that if they if they looked and acted and smelled like the animal they were pursuing, they would be more successful in the pursuit. So that's how masking started,
Huh.
as best I can figure out. And of course, that activity where men you can just imagine thousands of years ago, men organizing a hunt and having a spiritual conclave the night before around a campfire, uh, uh, begging the spirit of the animal to give itself up for the benefit of humans.
Right.
Right? Animals have a spirit.
Yep.
Right? Uh, and and we know this because current indigenous societies still today believe that. Uh, and so these men would put on the head and hide and pelt of the animal they were pursuing. That was the object. It was the mask, right? And they would probably engage in some sort of a ceremony, which would involve, lighting torches at night and make pounding on drums and blowing into conch shells, making noise, and having a ritual, which would be preceding the hunt. And the mask itself was the focus of that activity, and that happened in hunter-gatherer societies around the world. And that's how masking started. And if you think about, it wasn't just decoy. You have to act like the buffalo, right? You have to pretend you're a buffalo. So it's acting, it's
Right.
theatrical. So it's not only decoy, but you're acting as a buffalo, right? And it's spiritual, because you've asked the buffalo to give itself up for your family or your clan or your tribe. So that's fundamentally how masking started. And of course, through the millennia, masking has become theatrical. Greek and Roman times. Uh, it seems that humans today have to mask. I think it's part of our psychological DNA that we and masking incidentally is anything you do to yourself that's
Oh,
transformational. It's not. We tend to think of masking as, putting on a mask of a clown and acting like a clown, or putting on a mask of an old man and acting like an old man. That's the extreme, and that's the extreme of masking. The masking is really anything you do during your day that is in any sense transformational. When people wake up in the morning and get dressed, they're making a probably a semi-conscious, in fact, in most cases, a semi-conscious decision as to how they want to see themselves that day and how they want other people to see them. And then you remask to the venue. So I got dressed this morning and I have whatever I'm wearing, and if I go out to a fancy restaurant to with my wife for dinner, I'll probably
right,
change my mask, right?
right. Well, and in a way, it goes back to what you were speaking of originally in terms of survival. And, even today, I think the pace of life is so fast, to really feel like you're on your game or, responding quickly to different situations, you sometimes need to, adapt different personas or different ways of interacting with the
Yes,
world. And
absolutely,
I think that's one of the challenges, that maybe back in the day
yeah.
it was a very specified activity that occurred at a particular season or a particular time of the month,
Hmm.
whereas today the stimuli coming at you is so fast and furious. You need to put your game face on, so to speak.
Sure,
um,
sure.
but that's very interesting.
Well, and what the Catholic friars observed when they arrived here was the indigenous population masking frequently as a way to petition the spirits, the god. In their belief system, they had a pantheon of deities, or gods or spirits that would be called upon, and the way they would bring the spirit from the spiritual world to the temporal world for an outcome would be and it was male. Men would mask in a ceremony. I'll give you an example. If you were planting crops in the springtime and you wanted it to rain, if you were in the Aztec society, you would mask as Tlaloc, the rain god, and to ask the spirit of rain to benefit the harvest, or Tonatiuh, the spirit of the sun. These are different gods around the agricultural cycle. So it was, in a sense, spiritual. Masks were also used to help people back then deal with things that we can now explain through science, but were frightening and mystifying to societies, like an eclipse, thunder and lightning, a volcanic eruption, or a drought that produced famine, perhaps. These were things that people didn't understand, and masks were used to invoke the spirits to mitigate or to intervene in these mystifying occurrences. So masking is something that I think I'm right in saying that in all society, almost all societies, I believe, masking has been interpreted by archaeologists and their anthropologist friends through interpreting cave paintings and rock surface paintings. It goes back thousands of years.
Right. Well, and I think it's a way of kind of maybe self-preservation, and um, that still goes on today. But I want
Yeah.
to share with listeners a quote that I came across in the museum, which is from one of the Markmans. Um, we
Yeah.
admire Mexican masks not only for their intrinsic plastic value, but because they are so closely linked to the fervor, the ethic, and the vigor with which a town dresses itself in order to define itself, to show in the thousand faces of its masks its expressive capacities and its deep cultural roots. And I love that. So I thought maybe you could just
Mhm.
elaborate a little bit and share um, some of your knowledge about the actual role of the masks in the life of a community.
Um, yeah, the mass ceremonies are really part of a fiesta. Uh, Mask dancing is part of an overall fiesta. And because of the influence of the Catholic friars, the friars when they came here started using mass, even though the native masks were destroyed and forbidden to be used because they represented the wrong gods. Right? The friars started because they couldn't communicate with their audience. They didn't share a common language initially until the friars learned native languages and the natives learned Spanish. There was a real problem here because the friars were here to Christianize, to evangelize. And they basically took advantage of the indigenous fondness for the behavior of masking. And they started making masks to represent characters in Bible stories as a way to teach through theater the story. So, and that stuck with the native population. That's still going on today, 500 years later, in many, many villages and small communities in Mexico. The mask performance is actually a reenactment of the Bible story at that time of the year. So, the fiestas in Mexico tend to be built around principally the Catholic liturgical calendar. Christmas, Easter, Carnival, Day of the Dead. These are big dates in the Catholic calendar, and this is when the Feast of the Holy Cross, the Feast of the Assumption, the Feast of the Virgin of Guadalupe, Corpus Christi. These are big dates in the Catholic calendar. This is usually when the fiestas are going on, and also national holidays like Independence Day and Constitution Day, where people have a 3-day weekend and can organize a fiesta. But a fiesta is really a community's expression of its cultural roots, right? It's often religious. People go to church every at least once every day, and it's all about a community organizing its limited resources for food and drink and fireworks and paying the musicians, and out come the dancers and the masks, and it's the mass ceremony is very much part of a fiesta. So the religious use of mass is still going on today, big time, still very strong. Masks are also used in villages to reenact historical events like the Dance of the Conquest, where Cortez and the conquistadores
Hmm.
are fighting Montezuma and the Aztecs. These are all masked characters. Yeah. There's also occupational dances, a different category of dances. They're the dance of the farmers, the tlacoloreros. It's called the dance of the fish. These are as best I can tell, and best I can tell, it's a dance or performance that says it pays homage to the people in the village who are providing protein for the villagers, as best I can tell. So there's a general category. If the categories of mass are religious, historic, and occupational, those are the main category. Then there's of course carnival mass. Carnival mass are worn the week before Lent as a way to disguise yourself so you can misbehave and that people don't know it's you, right? But that's a
Right.
separate subject. Um, did I answer your question or just scratch the surface?
Yes, yes, you did. I mean, that gives a good overview, and I'd like to just step back a bit, and then really start talking about some of the specific celebrations
Yeah,
and what occurs, and maybe have you share a description of the masks associated with those particular fiestas. But
sure,
before we do
sure.
that, can you talk about, how you got started with your collection
Mm,
and, how you began finding and meeting the artisans and how you were received by them when you sought to buy pieces and maybe
okay,
share a couple of special
sure.
encounters or relationships that you've developed?
Uh, I I I always tell visitors to the museum right away when I'm talking to them that I come back for the 25 years I've been doing this. I come back from trips very frequently with no masks. Just because I want to buy a mask in a village doesn't mean I can. Masks are very often, and this is important, they're very often part of a family, and they should stay in the family. I very often am in a conversation with the performer who's wearing a mask that he would tell me was made by his great grandfather, and his grandfather wore it, and his dad wore it, and in 3 years from now, his son's going to wear it. And I would no way buy that mask. That mask belongs in the family. It should stay there. And I hear this quite often. Masks are very much an heirloom within a family. The other obstacle to acquiring masks is that Some of the masks that are used for more important religious characters like Saint Joseph or Santiago de Compostela in the Dance of the Moors and Christians, the mask that represents Santiago, patron saint of Spain, those masks are communal property. They're owned by the village. They're so important to a village that the mask belongs to the village, and the person who's wearing it, he's allowed to use it as an honor for being an exemplary citizen, or giving a lot of money to the church or something. But so very often I come back, but if I'm doing research and getting good information about the ceremonies, I consider that to be a successful trip. But what happens when I'm in a village, I tend to go to places I haven't been before, because there's thousands of villages in Mexico where they do these fiestas, these ceremonies with masks. And so I go the day before a fiesta or the morning of a fiesta, and I ask to speak to the somebody of authority who can allow me to see the fiesta. And I carry a pocket full of snapshots of the collection of the museum. And I've learned many years ago that's a very quick way to establish a credential, why I'm there. They understand right away that I'm a collector of Mexican ceremonial masks, and that my purpose would be to acquire masks. So that's an icebreaker, right? And then sometimes the word gets out that there's this gringo, me, who speaks Spanish, me, who wants to buy masks, me, and that so people come up to me frequently, and how much will you give me for my mask? So I don't have a problem engaging in a negotiation, but that's how it goes. But again, I very often I see a mask that I would die to have, and I can't buy it because it's part of a family, and
Right.
should stay there.
And have there been,
Yep.
is there a particular location that, you really enjoy going to, or are there particular artisans that you've developed relationships with over the years?
Yeah, I know a few. I know a few mask makers. By the way, a little secret that I'll share with you and your listeners. Mask makers make new masks, and they make masks for the village. They don't make masks. Generally, they don't make masks for the commercial market, right? Um, but the villagers in some of these tiny little villages, the villagers don't have money to buy a mask, and in some cases, they don't necessarily want to own a mask, but they want to participate in the fiestas, particularly Carnival, right? So here's my secret: mask makers very often rent masks to the villagers, and when they're returned, and they do this year after year after year, and when they're returned, those masks I would consider authentic because they've been performed. And mask makers will sell those masks because they have no particular emotional attachment to them. It's commerce, right? So my little secret that I hope none of your listeners pay attention to is that mask makers are sometimes a very good source of performance masks, right? And I know a few mask makers that I've met, in one gentleman in particular in Michoacan that I contact frequently, and they have a mask making work. Incidentally, most mask makers don't make a living off making masks. Usually, they're supplementing their income as carpenters or farmers or bricklayers or what have you. They just happen to have a particular skill in carving and the right tools to do it.
Bill, now I'm going to single out some of the masks in the museum that I found particularly interesting, either because of the visual creativity or the story behind the mask. And I love the background on both the mask and the tradition, as well as how you came to acquire these particular masks. So, because it's a big category, let's start with the Carnival celebrations. And, I invite you to kind of provide the big picture and then come down on a more micro level to talk about a couple of specific
Okay,
masks.
fine. Yeah. Carnival is a celebration that goes on in many parts of areas of Mexico, and it's it's the week before Lent. The Lent is, the 40 days of penitence leading up to Holy Week and Easter Sunday, and it's a Catholic celebration, but it's really a time where people can. We tend to think of Carnival. Immediately, we think of New Orleans, Mardi Gras, or we think of Rio de Janeiro and the big floats and semi, scantily clad women. But Carnival in indigenous Mexico. Is in these little villages that I visit is really an opportunity for the local population to uh, have their world be turned upside down, and they're allowed to do things and say things that they would never be allowed to do or say during the rest of the year. It's kind of in a certain way. It's and again, I'm not a social scientist, but it's clear to me that this is an opportunity for uh, individuals and groups of individuals to release social tensions, and it's probably a useful uh, celebration. It's very religious. It's a week long celebration where everybody is they decorate the town, and there's fireworks and mask dancing, of course. And food is provided for the village, even though they have often very limited resources. But it really is the masks that are being used at Carnival, unlike masks that are for most other ceremonies. They're not really for role playing. You're not wearing a mask of a bull because there's a dance of the bulls. You're wearing a mask because you're wearing it to mask who you are, so that you can misbehave, as I mentioned, do things and say things that you might not be inclined to do or say during the rest of the year. So um, uh, very often people can say things about their neighbor or take a pot shot at the local priest or the local politician, and they're doing this behind a mask. And it's in these very little villages, these very small communities. Everybody knows everybody's mask, but it doesn't. It seems to be okay. It's people are releasing, venting, if you will, social tensions, and the masks that are worn at Carnival. Again, they're not worn for role playing; they're worn for disguise, and so masks very frequently, very often, are animal masks. There's a donkey or a mule or a cow or a bull. And again, there's no dance of the bulls. It's simply, and by the way, this is the only time very rarely do I see women wearing masks in ceremony, but this is the time. Carnival is the time where the rules are waived, and women uh, often are wearing masks during the carnival celebrations.
Um, I love the whole idea that there's this kind of tacit understanding that we can all just let it all hang out. And, I mean, it's in a way, it's kind of the anti-masking, because you're getting to indulge your dark side, if you will. And I think often of masks as ways of disguising that you even have that dark side. Um, but can you talk a little bit about, do you have a favorite masks in the collection that relate to Carnival? And, are there any stories about particular masks that you have in the collection?
And not really. As a matter of fact, very often the performers during carnival will be wearing a mask that they might use in a different time of year for a different ceremony. It's just they happen to have a mask uh, from let's say the dance of the Moors and Christians, or a negrito mask, or whatever, and they'll put that on during carnival. And often it's really funny because I'm sure that everybody knows everybody's mask, but it doesn't seem to matter. Uh, and
Right.
I'm frequently, just as a general comment, Meg, I'm very often asked about my favorite masks. People are in the museum. There's roughly 600 masks they're looking at, and they often are curious to know what my favorite mask is. And the answer, I don't have a favorite, frankly. I see this as anthropology, or a study of social custom. Um, I don't. if there's an answer, if there's a legitimate answer to the question, what is my favorite mask? The answer would be the one I'll find next week.
Right.
That
I get that.
and then that's my favorite until a week later. Yeah,
Right.
So
Yes, it's kind of the quest
yeah,
and seeing really the custom in all its multifacetedness,
sure.
if that's
What
even a
what
word.
what I look for in all masks, and when I'm collecting, when I'm out in the countryside, is rarity. Certainly, there could be a mask maker that passed away years ago, and one of those masks is available for purchase. Carving style, how well it's carved, and so forth. But and I love patina. I like old masks that have shown signs of wear, and have very often, because they're repainted often every year, they develop a thick layer of paint that starts to develop a lovely patina. So that's kind of the things I'm looking for.
Mhm. And is there anything more that you would say about Carnival before we move on to
Not really.
another
There are places in Mexico where carnival is similar. Veracruz or Manzanilla. Where they have big carnival celebrations. Not on the order of Rio de Janeiro, but I tend to go to the smaller villages, and the carnival in these smaller villages is really um, a village celebrating itself and allowing people to do things and say things that they wouldn't perhaps be allowed to do or say during the rest of the year. It's quite interesting.
Yes, I bet. Well, looking at another celebration, and forgive me if I mangle the pronunciation here, but the dance of the Viejos. Is there a story behind that? And
Yeah. hmm it's viejos means old man or little old men. Viejitos is little old men, or viejos, little old men. Um, and the dance of the viejos really goes back to pre-Hispanic dedication to the god or the spirit he was called Huehueotl, which is the god of wisdom, uh, and the god of age. And it's still done, and it's changed, of course, morphed over the centuries. But it goes back to, in fact, there was a Dominican friar named Diego Duran who wrote about this, and in a book. uh, he died in 1588, but he wrote in the history of the Indies of New Spain. He wrote about that dance, the dance of the viejos, the dedication to Huehueotl. And so age in general, and a mask that shows age or of an old man, for example, really is an honor or an acknowledgement that wisdom comes through age. And that's the root of this ceremony. And it's done, the most well-known dance of the viejos is in Michoacan, around the Lake Pátzcuaro region. And those masks represent old men who the natives, when the Spaniards arrived, thought that the Spaniards looked hilarious as they aged because their hair turned gray. They had facial hair, of course, which the natives here did not have. And as natives here, as their hair, as they grew older, their hair did not turn gray, whereas the Spaniards did. So the natives thought that the Spaniards looked quite interesting as their skin wrinkled, their teeth started to fall out, their hair turned gray on their face as well as their head, and so they started mocking the Spaniards in the dance. So the dance of the viejos, uh, in many cases, is a spoof of Spaniards as they aged. But the interesting story in Michoacan is that during the colonial period, the Catholic Church extracted tithes from the citizens in a community, and at Christmas time they raised the tithe, the amount of money that, by the way, very often the tithe was paid in with live animals, or the cosecha, the
hmm
crops, the harvest. People were required to pay to the Catholic Church a tithe, and it's called a diezmo. It's 10%. Diez is 10. the diezmo. And at Christmas time, the Catholic Church extracted even more as a percentage of what a family would be able to contribute. And in Michoacan, in certain places in Michoacan, the natives did not have the ability to pay this tithe, especially at Christmas. And so the the dancers would go inside the church and perform the dance of the Viejos in at the altar of the church as a way to pay their tithe, a dedication
Mm,
to the baby Jesus at Christmas time.
fascinating. And what do the masks? So the masks then are of old men.
What do they look like?
Yes.
They're typically carved of wood, and they're um, I'm the most common old man is a wrinkly face. Could be an old woman too, by the way. It doesn't have to be a viejito. Could be a viejita.
Hmm.
Wrinkly face, one or two, only one or two teeth in the mouth because all the other teeth have fallen out. Um, uh, the hair on the head or the beard is always white, gray, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that's what a viejo looks like. Hmm.
That's interesting. I mean,
Yep.
it's an insight into a whole different dimension. So, they're paying homage, I guess, in a way, and yet at the same time they're mocking the people and
Yeah.
the
Well, it's yeah,
Spaniards.
yeah. It's a bit of I don't want I don't want to offend Catholics, but the Catholic Church for decades had extracted the diezmo, the 10%, uh, from individuals and families. You were required to give to the church, and of course, the church was then supposed to be uh, taking this. There were big warehouses in these villages where the produce, live animals, the produce would be housed, and the Catholic Church then, of course, would be distributing this to the most poor people in the village. That was the concept, right?
Mhm.
Um, how well that was executed could only be ascertained if you were watching the priest driving a BMW.
Right. And was there any consciousness on the part of the Spaniards that these masks were in fact making fun of them, or was it
I've
just
I've heard, and I don't know. I've heard that the Spaniards thought that they were being revered in these ceremonies, and in fact they were being mocked. But I don't I don't know if that's true or not. The masks themselves, and I have a photograph in the museum of Viejos from Michoacan that goes back to 1859. Somebody took a photograph and it was printed in a book, and the masks themselves uh, look like they look hilarious. So I can't imagine the Spaniards would be thinking they're being revered, but I don't know.
well, it's interesting. I mean, it goes back to this idea that everything is open to interpretation. And,
Yep.
sometimes people can be in denial about things. But
Yeah.
in any event, looking at
Yeah.
another
Yeah.
celebration, and again, forgive my lack of Spanish fluency, but
Hmm.
um, Dia de los Muertos, that's a
Yes.
biggie. So tell us about that.
Yes. 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 Well, first of all, I would encourage your listeners the podcast listeners to see the movie Coco, the the Pixar movie
Uh
Coco.
huh.
It will clearly explain the idea of in a very warm and wonderful way the idea that in Mexico, and I suppose in other Latin American countries, especially in middle and lower class society, the idea that the deceased in your family are still very much part of your family. Um, and at Day of the Dead, families will put out the favorite food of the deceased in the family. There's always in the home a photograph of the deceased, uh, uh, a little, they call it an altar or bóveda, uh, and there'd be a votive candle always lit, a fresh flower always next to it. But at Day of the Dead, this is the celebration at the end of October, early November. Um, you would put out that person's favorite food and uh, marigold petals on the floor underneath the altar, leading out to the street, so that their spirit could find their altar and find their favorite food. This was a common, this still is a common behavior in rural indigenous parts of Mexico. The ceremonies that are done today that involve masks, particularly in San Luis Potosi, Veracruz, and I guess certain parts of Puebla, uh, the masks of the that are performed at Day of the Dead represent lost souls who are in purgatory and looking for the road to
Mhm.
heaven, to the gates of heaven, and there those masks are the dancers perform, and then they go from house to house, and they beg for sustenance, food, to sustain them on their search for the road to heaven, to get out of purgatory. It's similar to, there's obviously a connection with
Right.
Halloween, um, in the States, where kids go from house to house asking for candy. But in Mexico, again, it's only in certain parts of Mexico, but it's quite common in hundreds of villages. The masks, the masked performers, after they dance in the ceremony in front of an altar, then they go from house to house and beg for food, and they get fed in the
Mhm, mhm.
homes, right? Uh, and in some cases, beggars actually, the dancers actually turn their back on the person answering the door, and they put out their left hand behind them, and because I guess they're embarrassed to be begging, so they turn their back on them, and the homeowner can put a coin, a peso or something in their hand if they're not being invited in
Mm.
for
And
food.
is the idea that this lost
Hmm.
soul that they're representing, is that someone they know, or is it just in general for all lost souls?
It's for the it's All Souls, family members, and it's also Dia de los Muertos in Mexico is 3 days. It's Dia de los Muertos Niños, Day of the Dead for children, All Souls Day, and All
Okay.
Saints Day. Right? There's three different categories of deceased that are being recognized at Day of the Dead.
Uh-huh.
It's really Days of the Dead. Children, saints, and souls. I'm not sure what order that falls in, but
And are any of
I'm
the
not exactly
masks
sure.
of children?
No, uh-uh,
Ah, okay.
no. They're masks that are often have a very distinctive grin, and it's showing the teeth with it initially it looks like a snarl, but if you ask the performers, they'll tell you it's a begging, it's a sign of begging, like please give me.
Ah,
Yeah, yeah,
okay.
very distinctive. Um, these masks are in my book on page 27.
Okay. I'll look for
That's a
that.
little plug, a little plug
Okay.
for the book, a little plug for the book.
Now, the next celebration I want to ask you about is the Battle of Cinco de Mayo.
Yep.
So that's, and maybe you can also explain the historical significance of the occasion.
Yeah, the masks that are used at Day of the Battle of Cinco de Mayo represent Mexican soldiers and French soldiers that are known. The French soldiers are known as Zouaves. That's Zuavos, Zouaves, and the Zouaves were a regiment of French Algerian soldiers who in 1862 marched from Veracruz toward Mexico City. The French were trying to reclaim their debt from Mexico, and they were intercepted by the Mexican forces and defeated on May 5th of 1862. And the celebration today is done only it's done in the city of Puebla, but the major events take place in the little village where the battle actually happened, up in the mountains of Puebla. It's a village called Zacapuatzla. Well, there's two villages, Zacapuatzla and Huehuetzingo, and it's a reenactment of that fight between the French and the Mexican forces. And the history of that is really, I think, interesting. It's in 1862, England, France, the United States, and I'm forgetting one country. England, France, United States, and Spain were all owed very significant amount of money from Mexico. They had loaned money to Mexico to try to get Mexico out of its burdensome debt, and the government, the conservative government in Mexico at the time, had managed to negotiate debt relief from Spain and England, and of course the U.S. at the time was embroiled in a civil war, uh, and so they were somewhat distracted. But the French were insistent on reclaiming their debt, and that's why they sent soldiers to Mexico. And so and of course Mexico is, as in many countries, always are looking for heroes and heroic deeds and heroic events. And so the Battle of Cinco de Mayo was one of those situations where the French forces were defeated by the Mexicans. The Mexicans tend to forget that 27 days later the French regrouped and marched into Mexico City, and installed Maximilian and Carlotta as the emperor and empress of Mexico. But we don't spend too much time on that. We celebrate, Mexicans celebrate the heroic event. So the dance, the performance is a mock fight between the French and the Mexicans. And I would just say one other thing that's kind of interesting. There's a school of thought, a history interpretation of history, that if the United States had not been embroiled in a civil war and had insisted on reclaiming their debt, there was discussion in the U.S. Congress at the time of annexing the rest of Mexico, the part of Mexico that didn't already belong to the United States. And But because we were distracted with the Civil War, uh, that didn't happen. So there's a school of thought that says if it weren't for the Civil War, I would be talking to you from the United States of America.
Huh. Interesting. Well, it's fascinating to think about, the twists and turns that history takes, and what might have been had not there been
Yep.
this or that going on. And it's interesting to me because I think most people don't necessarily uh, realize that there is a French influence or factor in Mexico's history. I mean, I think the relationship with Spain and the Spanish is very well recognized, but it's interesting to have this conversation because it weaves in, a different dimension of Mexico's history. And I think most people think of Cinco de Mayo as a completely different, having a completely different meaning.
Well,
You
y- yeah.
go
I mean,
ahead.
May 5th in the United States. I mean, and a lot of people think that May 5th is Mexican Independence Day. I mean,
Exactly.
it's become prostituted by the liquor companies into a time to drink tequila and margaritas and yell "Viva Mexico." But that it's certainly not the Mexican Independence Day. That's September 16th.
Right. So I love that having a conversation about something like masks is such a window into the history of a country and, maybe some fallacies or misperceptions about, historic events. Um,
Well, that's precisely what happened to me. I started collecting masks because I thought they looked cool aesthetically, and I knew they had some meaning because of all the conversations I'd had with my anthropologist friend in Mexico City. But it was a door that opened into history, um, because of mask ceremony that I found as fascinating as the mask itself.
And I love that when you have a passion or you're drawn to something and it just grows and grows and grows on you, I think it's a very lucky development when people find something that can sustain their interest, for long periods of time.
Yeah,
I don't think everybody
true,
has
true.
that
No, I got very lucky. I always jokingly say that I could have been uh, interested in sports cars or something frivolous,
Right.
but I just became really interested in this. I think it's because I'm an American living in Mexico that I'm not sure I would have had the same passion of studying the Native American societies had I been in Racine, Wisconsin or something. But
Well,
anyway,
I do think there is an
who
element
knows?
of,
Who knows?
what fascinates us in many cases, can be something that is unknown or, to take that even
Right.
further, exotic. And
Yeah.
yet at the end of the day, I think our conversation bears out, um, we're all human and everything we're talking about is a very specific, localized manifestation of universal, desires or needs. And that's the thing that I love about culture is that there are all these, very unique and
Yeah.
rich traditions. But if you dig into the impetus and the motivation, it's something that's just part of our human condition. Um,
Right. Absolutely
and
right.
so now to look at another tradition, let's talk about the Pharisee masks and the Passion of Christ.
Ah, okay, sure. There are many because of the influence of the Catholic friars when they first came here, teaching Bible stories through masked theater to the natives. Because I think I mentioned this earlier in the podcast. They didn't, the friars initially couldn't communicate with their audience, in terms of teaching the tenets of Catholicism, and so they started making masks of characters in Bible stories in order to teach the Bible story. This goes back almost 500 years. So this is still going on today. And around the key Catholic dates, Christmas, Easter, Carnival, and Day of the Dead, particularly, uh, mask ceremony is really in most cases reenacting the Bible story. And probably the most dramatic is the reenactment of the Passion of Christ at Easter time. And all the characters that you know from Cecil B.
Right.
DeMille's movie, or or you Charlton Heston fans out there, um, the all the characters that you know from the resurrection story would include. Uh, the Pharisees. The Pharisees were a sect of Jews that didn't agree with Christ's teachings, and the reenactment today is that these characters, masked characters, chase Jesus uh, and capture him and turn him over to the Romans, the centurion guards, which are also masked characters in this reenactment. So the Pharisees chase Jesus and turn him over to the centuriones, as we say in Spanish. Um, and then there's a trial. I forgot. There's a Last Supper. There's 12 people sitting at a table, all masked, and the most significant character, of course, is Judas Iscariot, because Judas, again, according to the legend, uh, identifies Jesus to the Romans. He essentially is a turncoat, and so. Uh, and then there's a trial, and Pontius Pilate denies trying Jesus, and Caiaphas does. Again, these are masked characters. And there's one other character in the reenactment,
Hmm.
Barabbas, the thief, who otherwise would have been crucified. But as was custom in the Judea during Christ's time at Passover, uh, it was accustomed to free a criminal, and Barabbas is that character. So all these characters are in the performance of the reenactment of the Passion of Christ at Easter, and the Pharisees are the characters who for 40 days, these are youngsters. I think you have to be 14 years old or older to be a Pharisee, but you have to promise. This is in the Yaqui and Mayo indigenous cultures in the northern part of Mexico. You have to promise the town elders that you will be a Pharisee. I think it's for 6 consecutive years, um, and perform. In the performance, what you do is you act out this character uh, for, I believe it's, I think it's 20 days or something like that. So you're not allowed to speak when you're wearing your mask. You are not allowed to speak. You could only act out the fool and chase this other character named Jesus. But Pharisee masks tend to be. There are three indigenous cultures in Mexico: the Cora in Nayarit, and the Yaqui and Mayo in Sonora and Sinaloa, where the dancer, the performer, who's a Pharisee, believes that their mask absorbs evil, and they have to go through a rite of purification on Saturday of Holy Week. Christ is symbolically crucified on Friday night, and of course Easter Sunday is the next day. But on Saturday, these dancers destroy their mask as a rite of purifications. So these masks are very, very, very hard to come by. In fact, the only reason they would ever sell me one of these masks is knowing that I'm leaving. So they're
Ah,
dumping the evil spirit on me, on me, right? But in general, probably 95% of the dancers in those three subcultures that I mentioned, Cora, Yaqui, and Mayo, they have to
wow.
destroy their mask. It's a rite of purification. It's quite interesting. Yeah.
Wow. And then just to um kind of help me and other listeners visualize the
hmm
actual celebration, does it take the form of a parade, or is it literally like a theater performance, or is there music, or
No, it's more of a parade, but there's parts of it like the Last Supper where these actually that very often it's children who play the apostles, right? Uh, and uh, and so but the when the Pharisees come into town to chase Jesus, it's kind of like a parade, and there's some of them wearing on horseback, and it's a long line. There could be 100 different performers who come in as Pharisees, but that is a parade, and then they dance to drums, tambores, in front of the church.
and um excuse me, if someone wanted to attend one of these fiestas, how do you find out about them? And are visitors welcome? And how long do they go on? And I know myself from I enjoy attending these when I'm
hmm
able to. When and
hmm
a lot of the difficulty can actually be finding out where they are taking place and when.
Yeah.
But if you could talk a little bit about just being able, to actually
Well,
witness.
yeah, I have. It really. I'm sorry that the answer is it depends, but but the smaller the village, the more indigenous parts of Mexico you're in, the more it's required that you have permission to be there. And so I think I mentioned this earlier. You have to go seek out somebody of authority and get them to allow you to see the fiesta. Um, and so because I very often the performers are under the influence. It's part of a party,
Mhm.
you know, uh, and so you have to be very careful. Even if I have permission to see a fiesta, I always feel comfortable standing next to somebody who's given me permission to
Right.
see the fiesta, because then the dancers out there looking at me can see me next to somebody of authority, and that seems to be, well, all I need as permission to be there, right?
Right.
Uh, so it's not something you can't. Then and there are other places I go where there's a dance festival, where there's tour buses, right?
Right. Well, it's a spectrum, I
Uh,
guess.
and and knowing when the fiesta is really it again, that depends too. If Christmas, Easter, Carnival, Day of the Dead, those are fixed dates,
Right.
right? Uh, Knowing which village is going to, if you're in the indigenous parts of Mexico, the smaller villages in Chiapas, Campeche, Tabasco, the Yucatan, certain parts of Oaxaca, in the mountains of Veracruz and Puebla, I mean, most of the villages are having these fiestas.
Right. Well, and speaking of which, a fiesta that I did have the ability to attend that I loved was the Dance of the Parachicos in Chiapas, and
Yeah, yeah,
that
that's
has some
that's
very cool history associated with it. But I'll let you speak
yeah.
about that. Can you share the story?
Well, sure, sure, and that's probably, you're right. That's probably one of the most dramatic performances, because there's literally in the town is called Chiapa de Corzo, Chiapas. It's right real close to the capital city of Tuxtla Gutierrez, the capital of the state of Chiapas. And on the feast day of San Sebastian, which is January 20th, they have this huge parade of dancers, and their masks and their headdresses are quite interesting. But and the other thing is interesting, that the church lets the dancers perform inside the church, which is quite, so the part of the ceremony is inside the church, and then of course they go outside on the street to dance. But um, the Parachicos, the story I've been told about the dance, from different people, is that in the 19th century, I guess it was the 19th century, there was a a woman a wealthy woman, and I've heard variations on that. She was the wife of the viceroy of New Spain. This might have been actually this 18th century. Yeah, um, and she had a child, a young boy, who was very ill, and the medical uh, the medical attention that the child got in Mexico City. I've also heard she was from Guatemala, but let's just say, for the sake of the story, that she's from Mexico City. She and her son, they moved to Chiapa de Corzo, so that she could be treated, her son could be treated by shamans, by curanderos, the medicine uh, medicine men. Uh, and she was a very wealthy woman. Uh, she apparently built a hospital, a medical hospital. She built a school for the village, and her son apparently was cured or partially cured. And But as he was undergoing the treatment from the shamans, the townsfolks would they made masks that looked like Spaniards, uh, to pay homage, I guess, to this woman and her son, with a very funny hemp crown on top of the mask. It's like a half of a bowl, made out of jute hemp, sisal they call it, sisal in Mexico. And they would apparently go to his home and perform in front of his home, or his window, so to help entertain the boy and make him feel good, improve his spirits. And that was the dance of the for the children,
Mm,
parachicos, the dance of the for the children, right? And this has been going on now since then, and it's of course expanded. The town has gotten bigger. It's become a big celebration. There are now tourists that go there to see this reenactment. But the mask itself is a highly car. The masks, incidentally, are made not by mask makers, mascureros. They're made by santeros. Santero is somebody who makes saints for the churches. These are highly skilled, very highly skilled carpenters or woodworkers, who are in a different category than mask makers. They have the masks have a very high level of skill reflected in the carving. They have glass eyes, uh, and uh, and this funny crown, this funny
mm.
headdress. So the masks are quite dramatic, uh, beautifully carved. But the santeros are basically making a living making saints for the churches, but they're supplementing their income
Yes.
making
Well,
the masks of the parachicos.
yes. Well, it's fascinating. I did not know that the masks were made by Santeros, and I
Yeah.
did a series on the Santeros of Puerto Rico, and I traveled across Puerto Rico and met quite a few of them. And the perception in Puerto Rico is that these carvers, have some kind of healing,
sacred spiritual capabilities that
Mhm.
qualify them for this work. Do you happen to know if that's true of the Santeros who create the Parachico masks?
No, I don't think there's a religious. I don't think. Yeah, Santeros. The word they may use in Cuba, and I guess in Puerto Rico for these spiritual healers, they're called Santeros, uh, and that's part of Santeria, right? In
Uh
Cuba.
huh.
In Mexico, the Santero is simply a mask maker. Actually, he's a saint maker. He makes saints,
Right.
but he himself is not imbued with any spiritual power, like a curandera would be, or a shaman.
Right.
They're not shamans; they're mask makers. Yeah.
Well, I have to say, for listeners, it's an exuberant, um, high energy, really fun festival. I felt extremely welcome, and it was a very special experience. Um,
It's absolutely beautiful. It's
yeah,
absolutely
it
beautiful.
is.
And the women are wearing. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with the Guelaguetza in Oaxaca, but the women are wearing the similar kinds of very ornately crafted dresses with a lot of jewelry, and the women are just elegantly dressed, along with these dancers, the Parachico dancers. It's really
It
beautiful to
is.
watch.
Now, one of the things we talked about when I, excuse me, visited the museum, what are the black masks and the slaves in
Uh huh.
Mexico. And this was a revelation to me, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. 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 Um, again, the dance of the negritos is is done in different parts of Mexico. Again, probably the most interesting area of Mexico is Michoacan, where the negrito masks represent Mexican blacks who very often are. You can often substitute because in the caste system of Mexico, the blacks were above the natives when they were brought here as slaves in the caste system, and so very often they were and rich Mexicans, of course, were pretty much as well as in the United States. Having blacks as your household servants was much more. Uh, it was a sign of wealth, right? If you had a houseboy or two, a black cook, in working in the home. Uh, this was much more a sign of wealth than if you had a native Mexican, and so. Uh, very often, particularly in Michoacan, you could substitute the word elegant for black. The dance of the negritos is the dance of the elegant ones because the dancers themselves wearing a black mask, these are natives wearing these are Mexican indigenous people wearing a mask of a black, but they're also wearing a business suit and all these ribbons and an elegant headdress because they're portraying themselves as being elegant. And the People don't realize that there was this huge importation of black slaves, and there's still a very large population of blacks in Mexico today. In fact, the Mexican government has just finished a survey identifying Mexicans who self-identify as being Mexican Afro Mexicano. We have African Americans now. Mexico and people who self-identify in the census. Now in Mexico, they've just done a survey, and there's 1.4 million Mexicans who claim to be of African descent and associate themselves with being Afro Mexicano. So it's a huge population. There are many, many, many villages in Mexico where blacks exist and live in small communities. Uh, but in any case, the dance of the dance of the negritos is a dance done by natives portraying blacks, and very often the blacks are depicted as being elegant or being uh, beautifully dressed. Uh, the black masks typically have aquiline
Mhm.
features, right? And and sometimes with blue eyes. It's a black mask with blue eyes. It's really odd looking, but um, just in just in case. Uh, this might be historically interesting, and I'll try to do it quickly. When the Spaniards arrived, and of course the natives here in this part of the world that we now call Mexico, this geography that now we call Mexico, there had been no prior exposure to Europeans, and so when the Spaniards came here, they brought with them germs, pathogens that the native population had no prior exposure to for 2000 for 20,000 years, since the migration across the Bering Strait and the migration south from the Aleutian Islands. There were thousands of years where the natives here had no prior exposure to Europeans, and so the Spaniards came, and they brought with them germs, particularly the seed of smallpox. And of course, in this hemisphere, there were no horses or cows or pigs or sheep or goats or chickens. Those animals were brought here by the Europeans, particularly the Spaniards, and they too had germs or pathogens that the natives had no prior exposure to. So the
Mm.
the whole huge populations were decimated by disease. Not only smallpox, but different strains of influenza, what we call measles and mumps. And the blacks, for hundreds of years prior in West Africa, had already been exposed. The Spaniards, the Dutch, the French, uh, had already plied the coast of Africa, and already created a germ holocaust, which the natives, the blacks there, had recovered from. So blacks were brought here as slaves because they were much more disease resistant. They were bigger, stronger people than the natives, and of course the conquistadores, who were given land grants by the King of Spain, needed labor, and so blacks were brought over, and they brought with them very strong elements of their Yoruban and Bantu cultures. They had very, very deep cultural roots. And so there's certain parts in Oaxaca, for example, some of the dances that are done by black communities in Oaxaca, they actually dedicate the dance to Ruja, which is a West African god in the belief system of the blacks. And this is 500 years after the conquest. It's quite interesting.
Right. Well, and it's quite interesting that we're talking about dances or masking that relate to um, blacks, and yet one is the Mexican interpretation, and then the other, you're talking about is um, people celebrating their own heritage. And
Right.
I do think it's very impressive and very powerful that people can retain and continue to celebrate, their roots and their lineage. And I think for so many different nationalities, there's been a sense of disconnection and dilution. And um, so I think that's one of the reasons that there is this fascination with masks or with any tradition that has been able to endure despite being, uprooted and dislocated. So, um, a- a-
Just to that point, Megan. Again, I may have mentioned this earlier in the podcast, but a lot of what's going on in these little villages in Mexico during these fiestas or celebrations is really a manifestation of cultural
right,
identity. It's these villages feeling very strongly about their indigenous roots, and and of course at fiesta time it bubbles right up to the surface. It's really a celebration of cultural cohesion or cultural identity, and mask ceremony is just part of
right.
that.
Now, I want to touch on one last dance that is fascinating to me, is celebrated in Mexico, and that's the dance of the Moors and the Christians.
Yeah, Yeah, that's the one dance that I'm aware of that was actually imported from Europe. You know that just 30 years before Cortes arrived here, the Moors were defeated in Spain. The Islamic Moors, the final battle uh, where the Moors were finally defeated, happened in Granada uh, in 1492, the same year Columbus discovered America. That was just 30 years before Cortes arrived here. And you recall that the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, had been occupied for 700 years by non Christians, by Jews, Berbers, and Moors. And part of the efforts of the Crusades failed to Christianize the Iberian Peninsula. The Crusades ended in 1291. The final battle in Granada happened in 1492, 200 years later. Parts of Spain and Portugal had already been Christianized, but the final battle happened just before Cortes arrived here. And Cortes and his conquistadores were very, very religious. And they, as part of the process of evangelization here in Mexico, um, performed the dance of the Moors and Christians for the native population here with absolutely no intent to explain what Islam was to the natives here. It was simply a dramatization of the triumph of Christianity over anything else. And so the Christians are led by Santiago de Compostela, the patron saint of Spain, against the Moors, who are led by this character called Mohammed, right? And it's a mock fight between good and evil, Christian, non Christian, where the Christians always win. And that was done for the native population here early on in the conquest, again, to repeat, to dramatize the triumph of Christianity over anything else you might want to believe. But that dance, that performance is still done all over Latin America, really, but particularly strong throughout many villages in Mexico, and it's done in other parts of Latin America, and the Caribbean, and it's also still performed in Spain and Portugal. Excuse me, in the Philippines, where there was a Spanish Catholic evangelization. So, and it's still done in Spain and Portugal as well. So it's a imported performance and imported dance. And the Moors very often, the mask of a Moor is very often looks like a Spaniard, because the natives here, when they started doing the performance themselves, would mask as their oppressors, the bad guys in their mind were the Spaniards. So very often the masks of Moors look like Europeans, but
Right.
not necessarily like Othello, right? The Shakespearean character. But it's the and Santiago, the Saint James, the patron saint of Spain. That mask is very often a white horse. The dancer is actually has shoulder straps, and around
Hmm.
his waist is a white horse. He carries a sword in his right hand and a cross of Christ in the other hand, and he leads his Christians against the infidels, the Moors.
And I'm just going to ask one more question about this, which is fascinating to me. It seems that the continuation of this tradition by the indigenous population um, is yet another example of um, how we filter and interpret what's told to us and create our own meaning for it. I'm assuming that when this tradition is continued every year, that they're not celebrating the victory of the Christians over the Moors.
No.
And I mean, what is the meaning? And because for something to be carried on, I understand that certain annual events kind of take on their own meaning and they exist just because
Hmm.
they're long standing. But
Hmm.
what are the people
Yes. Yes.
celebrating?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's lost its meaning. I mean, what seems to be it's good versus evil. As far as I can tell, there are four archetypes of not good, four archetypes of that aren't Christian, right? In ceremonial dance. One is the Antichrist, the Diablo, the
Yep.
devil, right? That's the opposite of it's the opposite of Jesus, who's all good, is the
Yep.
devil, all bad, right? The other archetype are Jews, Pharisees, Fariseos, right? Who Mexican, the native villages in Sonora and Sinaloa and Nayarit that are performing the reenactment of the Passion of Christ, these people don't have any idea. They're not anti-Semitic. They call their masks Pharisees, Fariseos. They don't call their masks Judíos, Jews, right? They have no idea. To your point, it's become uh, symbolic with just not Christian, right? It's not like these natives uh, know about the War of 47, the West Bank, Gaza, Palestine, Hezbollah. They don't know any of that, right? They have no baggage. They're not carrying any baggage against people of the Jewish faith. They call their masks fariseos because those are the guys and those are characters that chase Jesus and turn him over to the Romans to be crucified. That's all they know, right? And this has been going on for hundreds of years, right? Um, the third archetype would be Moors, Islamic Moors, but again, it's an archetype of not Christian.
Now,
Moros y
would you say though,
Cristianos.
Bill, is it an
What's
archetype
opposite?
of not Christian, or is it an archetype of, you know, for purposes of describing the perception, evil? Because going back to what we've talked about as far as how unique traditions are so, you know, can be so colorful and so fascinating, and yet underpinning that is this universal belief or need or desire. And I would say that you know every person on the planet has some belief in good versus evil, whereas the vast majority of people, or many
Right,
people, have no vested interest in Christian versus something else. So, yes. So
right,
that's what you're
right,
saying,
right.
really.
All I know is that I've seen four different archetypes, or this is Jungian babble, but an archetype, it's just the devil, a Jew, a Pharisee, I should say, a devil, a Pharisee, a Moor, and Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate has become archetypal. They call the people, the dancers who pit themselves against the Christians, as Pilatos, Pilates.
Mm,
And I guess that's simply because that guy back then decided not to try Jesus, so he became partially responsible for Christ's crucifixion. That's the legend, right? Uh, and it's always against Christianity. It's these archetypes are Christian, non-Christian,
right.
right?
But would you,
Uh, In
but
in
to,
in Catholic Mexico.
right. And so am I off base in saying that to, take it out one step further, it's not so much Christian versus non-Christian, but good versus evil? Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, sure. Absolutely, absolutely. Many of these celebrations aren't very religious at all.
Right.
They're not religious. They're. It's party
Right.
time.
Best cultural destinations tagline is people are culture and connecting is the destination. And for me, that's what it's all about, the idea of connection. And what I see in your collection and your fascination with the mask making and mask wearing tradition is this keen curiosity about different forms of connection. And then to take that further, you've created something that you share with a lot of other people. And
Mhm.
so you're kind of serving as a conduit. Um, so I guess I would just ask you, your views on whether um, this pursuit of yours has an element of a desire for connection and and what that means to you.
Um, well, the process of collecting and doing ethnographic research is one aspect of it. I mean, I've been doing this for years and years and years, traveling, visiting the villages, observing culture, elements of markers of culture, right? Language, dress, food, right? Folk art, music, dances with masks, all the things that you would see in a native village, in an indigenous village. So that's one aspect of it. Since I set up the museum for visitors, roughly almost 13 years ago, I have visitors to the museum almost daily, who come and, you're talking about connecting. The biggest one of the biggest bolts of reward I get is when people discover what I've discovered 30 years ago. They don't know that there's this very, very rich indigenous culture that still exists in Mexico today, and I explain to them that there are thousands of villages in Mexico where people live very much like their ancestors lived. So I enjoy. I guess what I'm saying is that I still collect, but my biggest enjoyment now, or my biggest cultural connection, is when people come and they're discovering in the museum something that they never knew about or never thought about. They think Mexico is Cancun or Acapulco or Puerto
Right.
Vallarta, uh, and all of a sudden they're in this museum and they sometimes they think I have to explain to them, because sometimes they think they're in a historical museum where this is the way it used to be, and sometimes I have to explain to them, no, 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 I could take you to any of these villages today and you could see these ceremonies. They're like, really? Yeah, yeah, really,
Right.
yeah, yeah. So I don't know if again, I'm babbling. I don't know if I answered your question, but
Well, I guess you did, and in fact, you inspired one more, and I promise it will be my last. But um, a lot of what we've talked about, to me, revolves around uh, the human need to belong.
mhm,
Do you observe
yeah.
that? Would you say that's a fair statement?
Well, yes, there's definitely a human need to belong. We have to have there's a group dynamic in all of us that has to be satisfied. And what I see in these villages, I don't know if you want this to pertain to me, but what I observe as an outsider, as a amateur ethnographer, an amateur researcher, when I'm in these native villages, is a very, very strong sense of cultural identity, especially during the fiestas. This is the need to, and I think I touched on this earlier. This is a need to self identify or group identify with a subculture under the pressure from the outside, the marginalization these people have suffered for 500 years in this part of the world. They've been marginalized. I think I said that geographically, socially, culturally, educationally, economically, and as a reaction to that marginalization, they developed this very, very strong sense of cultural identity or cultural
Mm,
cohesion. Uh, it's like gee, I can play tennis, so I should join a tennis club. Or church is a social it's social identity, in
right.
many respects.
Well, it's
And
nice
again,
to
I
know
don't know
there are
don't know if
people
I've answered your
that see
question.
the world as you do, and you know that are safe, and that you have some kind of shared values with, or shared experience set.
Yeah,
Well, in any event, Bill,
yeah.
this has been
My,
fantastic, and I thank you so much for a wonderful
thanks, Meg.
education, and just a great explanation of your passion.
Just last thing I want to say to your listeners
Yes.
is all of this is under threat of extinction, uh, because of globalization, the rise in technology, right? The internet, television, iPhones, all of this. Uh, Eventually, all of our what we call our ethnosphere, the ethnographic world we live in. If we don't destroy our planet first, if we don't destroy our biosphere first, which we probably will, our ethnosphere is shrinking, right? There's still many, many parts of the world where people can have a unique cultural experience. In fact, that's why people travel, right? Visitors to Mexico aren't they're not going from Cincinnati to Cleveland for vacation. They come to Mexico, and there's a reason for that. It's a cultural experience, and all of that is under threat of extinction eventually.
And
I'm not worried about it. I'm not worried about it in my lifetime or my children's lifetime or their children's lifetime or their children's lifetime, but eventually we're homogenizing.
Right.
We're homogenizing, and it's and there's nothing and there's less that we can do about that than we can do about our biosphere.
Right.
We can't what is threatening our ethnosphere is called progress. What is threatening our biosphere is called stupidity.
Right. Well,
That's my preaching for
well, I
today.
mean, and that makes all the more important the work that you're doing to document and record traditions. And in my own, way, that's what I'm doing too. But
Yep. Yep.
well, thank you again, and I'm delighted to have had this conversation.
Thank you, Meg. I enjoyed it.